Hello, National University Academy students. This is Mr. Goyette going over with you some information for your English 11A class, American Literature. Yesterday we discussed the Declaration of Independence, and we talked about some of the things that the British did, King George did to infuriate the colonists, and what led up to the writing of the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Adams put together the document that we now know as the Declaration. Now we're going to go a little bit towards the slavery era and talk about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain's novel. Samuel Clemens was his legal name, Mark Twain. I'm going to go over some themes with you, some themes you'll want to look out for and talk about on the discussion boards as we discuss the novel. Now, Huck, as a boy of 13 years old, is born in St. Petersburg, Missouri, along the beautiful river there. And it's a place that Twain loved. He loved being on the Mississippi. He loved boating, loved the great steam engines of the time and the paddle boats. And Twain wrote the novel about 2 decades after, about 20 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. But he chose to set the novel during slavery because he wanted to show some obvious contradictions in the society. Now, the issue of race and slavery is going to really inform the next 2 topics. So I'm going to start with racism and slavery. Reconstruction was still difficult, and Jim Crow laws existed at this time, and lynchings were common. Also, the grandfather clauses, which once emancipation was put through, blacks still did not have the same rights as whites, and in many cases were still treated not only as second-class citizens, but as citizens who had no right to continue a successful life in an integrated society. So this was to, in part, there was this view that they had to be protected from the black savage who was now released. And of course, Jim represents this, the slave in the story who's broken away and is free. And he's the one man who shows that humanity has nothing to do with race. He's probably the most down-to-earth, nicest guy you'll run into in there. But the conditions on the plantations were horrible for many slaves. One example would be on Solomon Northrop's plantation. It was rarely that a day passed by without one or more of the whippings. 100 lashes is called severe, and it is a punishment inflicted for standing idle in a field. This famous picture here of the slave being beaten, his back horribly scarred by being bludgeoned. So, and these beatings were common, but there were also situations where life on the plantations were, while you still had no rights as a slave, you had some basic freedoms. On Thomas Jefferson's plantation, we learn that his slaves were more co-workers, and while Thomas Jefferson often worked up in his study, Isaac, his chief slave, would basically run the plantation. He was more like a first-hand assistant of Thomas Jefferson's, who had a lot of freedoms and leeway. You can actually read his writings online. So we have this issue of racism and slavery, and Huck's going to see through it. He's the guy who sees that slavery is wrong, and of course, while people are trying to rear him, Miss Watson and Mrs. Sally Phelps and the judge, he sees that while they're trying to do him some good by educating him, he also sees that they're slaveholders and part of this society that is hypocritically Christian on one hand, but slaveholding on the other. It creates a moral confusion in the novel that we'll talk about with our next topic, intellectual and moral education. So we started with racism and slavery. The next big theme is intellectual and moral education. And we have, of course, Miss Watson and Pap as the father figures, mother figures in the novel. And of course, Pap is the worst of white society. He represents the worst part of white society. He's belligerent, he's a drunk, he shows the failure of the family, a man who does not parent his child in any successful way. In fact, he abuses and treats him poorly throughout. Because this novel is a Bildungsroman, Bildungsroman, it means that it's a novel showing a character's development from early stage onward, and it shows how the character is progressing in a social context, in this case the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South. But Huck's individual judgment against the hypocrisy of slave owners and drunk fathers, in this case his dad, shows that he is a keen observer, and while he has his own problems and issues with education and his own superstitions, he's still an intelligent boy of 13 years old. His raft and island exile, his living on this island for a while, kind of is a motif of showing his separate upbringing, how he's kind of raising himself in a way in a mixed up society, because he doesn't buy what the judge really wants to tell him and what Mrs. Watson wants to tell him, because he sees them as slave owning people. Huck reads the world around him and is pretty perceptive. He sees that Jim is probably the nicest, most down-to-earth guy, so he's developing his own moral education. He's rejecting some of the prim and proper things he's being told at Mrs. Watson's, even though they'd probably be good for him to pick up. He rejects them because it's connected to the traditions of slaveholding South. Tom Sawyer is a foil to Huck, in that in reading the adventure novels, he's fantasizing about killing, doing these raids and killing his neighbors, and he has this kind of crusader morality of killing the heathens and taking their money. And he gets this from Sunday school lessons and the adventure novels that he's reading. So that also leads to the intellectual and moral upbringing that can be confusing to Huck. This issue of civilized society, you'll notice that Twain in the opening of the novel misspells civilized, and because Huck is saying it a little awkwardly. Huck sees, and that's intentional, he's trying to show that Huck sees this attempt to civilize him as ridiculous, as somewhat false, because you can't be a civilized society in a slaveholding South. So that leads to the hypocrisy there, and you also see it in the judge's actions. This, I'm part of the civilized society, I'm going to rear you, and I'm the judge, so I'm going to give you back to your dad, who is a horrible parent. And that shows that because they're trying to do right by returning the boy to his father, they're actually doing wrong. Same situation comes up with Sally Phelps. Jim escapes. Sally sees that Jim is an escaped slave. Well, the only right thing to do is to return the slave to his master. And so Sally Phelps feels it's the right thing to return a slave to its owner. Now, of course, this shows, again, the moral hypocrisy, the moral absurdity of it, where you're, based on your Christian virtues, you're going to do something that's fundamentally wrong. You're going to return somebody as property to another human being. So Twain is showing that society is fundamentally bankrupt in moral value, and it can't be a just society because of slavery. And Huck sees through this. If not seeing it, he doesn't lecture you on it. He's just living his life, and you can see he remarks on it a little bit here and there. But Huck is not going to be this didactic character who's going to try to teach you that slavery is wrong. He's just going through life, enjoying Jim's company, and that's the lesson. That probably the best, most down-to-earth, nicest guy in the whole novel is this escaped slave named Jim. So that's it for today. Thank you for checking in, and I will talk to you again this afternoon. Bye now.